Welcome back, everyone, to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week, we don't just have the zchus of reading a new Parsha, we have the zchus of reading a new sefer, or starting a new sefer, and that is sefer Shemot. And last year, if you don't remember, it probably makes sense to listen to it again if you can. We did the Ramban's introduction to sefer Shemot, to sefer Geula, how he sees Geula and why he thinks the whole sefer is tied into the concept of Geula. Today, I want to start with the Ramban's idea of every sefer being separate. Now, obviously, every sefer is separate, right? There's the idea of the prakim and the parshiot and how they broke them up. That was a later thing. But sefer Bereishit is a separate sefer. Sefer Shemot is a separate sefer. And the Ramban wants, on the one hand, sefer Shemot to be a standalone sefer, like all the other Sfarim, and we'll have to do this when we come to Vayikra and Bamidbar and Devarim. But on the other hand, he obviously wants it to be a continuation. He doesn't want it to be its own book. He wants it to be the continuation of sefer Bereishit and the introduction in some way to sefer Vayikra. So let's start. So the first pasuk in the sefer says, Ve'ele Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma, Eit Yaakov ishu ve'to ba'u, and then the pasukim continue, Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, etc., etc. Very, very similar, if not identical, to the end of sefer Bereishit. So says the Ramban, V'ta'am, the first Ramban in sefer Shemot, if you exclude the introduction, V'ta'am ve'ele Shemot, ki ha'katuv yirtzel limnot inyan hagalut me'ed riditam leMitzrayim. The Torah wants to recount the story of our exile from the time we went down to Egypt. Ulefikach yachzor el techilat ha'inyan shehu mi pasuk v'chol zaro hevi ito Mitzrayma. V'sham katuv acharav ve'ele Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma. He's talking about the end of sefer Bereishit. V'oto ha'pasuk be'atzmo hu shehechzir bekan. And that exact pasuk from the end of sefer Bereishit is repeated at the beginning of sefer Shemot. Ki af al pi shem shnei sefarim, even though they're two separate books, hasipur mechubar bidvarim ba'im ze achar ze. Right? The books are obviously connected. The Two Towers is the second of the Lord of the Rings. On the one hand, it's supposed to stand on its own. On the other hand, it's a continuation of the Fellowship of the Ring. Right? That's how it has to be. Lahavdil. Okay, lahavdil elef alfe havdalos. But okay, so says the Ramban, it's the exact same thing here. Ki af al pi shem shnei svarim hasipur mechubar bidvarim ba'im ze achar ze. Obviously, sefer Bereishit is necessary to understand sefer Shmos. V'ka'asher hizkir b'nei Yaakov kitzer b'nei banav v'chol zaro. In sefer Bereishit, it doesn't mention his grandchildren. V'hechzir aklal ka'asher amar sham kol hanefesh beit Yaakov haba'am Mitzrayim shivim ukinyan hazeh b'sefer divrei hayamim. He says the exact same thing happens in the relationship between sefer divrei hayamim and sefer Ezra. Shehishlim divrei hayamim ubishnat achat lekoresh melach paras lechalot dvar Hashem b'fi Yirmiyahu he'ir Hashem et ruach koresh. That's the last pasuk of sefer divrei hayamim, and then it continues kol amar koresh melach paras va'oto shnei psukim. Those two psukim bilshonam hechzir berosh sefer Ezra lechaber hasipur. Right? Because the Torah wants you to know, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to know of the relationship between sefer Ezra and sefer divrei hayamim. So the same psukim that end sefer divrei hayamim are used as the introductory psukim to sefer Ezra. Says the Ramban, exact same thing here. The Torah wants to make the point that yes, sefer Shemot is a standalone sefer, and it is, but sefer Shemot is only based on what happened in sefer Bereishit. And so at the end of sefer Bereishit, you have the names of the Yordei Mitzrayim, and at the beginning of sefer Shemot, you have the names of the Yordei Mitzrayim. Exact same thing. Almost identical psukim with slightly more detail at the beginning of sefer Shemot. Because says the Ramban, even though they're related, and even though we think of Chamisha Chumshei Torah, sefer Shemot has to stand on its own, and people have to know who came down and why. And so you have at the beginning of sefer Shemot repetition from the end of sefer Bereishit to make that point exactly. Okay, at another time we can talk about what does it mean that and it's a fascinating question, what does it mean that every sefer of the Chamisha Chumshei Torah is a standalone on the one hand and is part of something else, right? Why is it so necessary? So again, I think it's the Ramban's theory that every sefer has its own theme, and every sefer stands for something different. Not contradictory, God forbid, but something different that adds up to the whole. Okay, but that's a bigger idea that we can do at another time. So that's the first pasuk of Sefer Shemot. Now, let's go to pasuk Yud Aleph in that first parak. Says the Torah, says Paro. No, says the Torah. Vayasimu alav sarei misim leman anoto besivlotam. And Paro put tax officials over them to make life difficult for us, the inui of the avodah. Vayiven arei miskinot lefaro et Pitom et Ramses. And we built, treasure cities for Paro. We built Pitom and Ramses. So the Ramban, I think, I'm not sure, but I think what he wants to do here is figure out how this happened. How did it happen that we became slaves to Paro? How did it happen from the first pasuk that, we came down to Mitzrayim because of the famine and everything was great, and then all of a sudden we're slaves? So says the Ramban on pasuk Yud Aleph, Sarei misim leman anoto, Sam al ha'am mas lakachad mehem anashim la'avodat hamelach. The first thing, says the Ramban, is the Egyptians taxed us. They taxed us money-wise, but more importantly, they taxed us by requiring a certain portion of the Jewish people to work for the king. Umina al hamas sarim min hamitzriim sheikchum bahem kirtzonam anashim lefi ha'avodah chalifot chodesh. O yoter yihiyu bibinyan hamelach. Okay, so they put people in charge of saying, okay, we need 10,000 workers for the next 6 weeks to do a particular job. Okay, the Jews have to give us 10,000 workers. They're not slaves, it's not forever, but for that period of time, they'll live with other slaves and they'll do Paro's work. Ushar hayamim bebeitel, but when that time period is over, they can go home. V'hasarim ha'elet sivu otam sheyivnu arim lefaro, vayiven ha'am arim miskinot lefaro b'mas hazeh. So in that original job, we need X number of Jews to build Pitom and Ramses for Paro. Okay, so they took them, and they took them for that period of time, and then they let them go home. V'ka'asher ra'u shelo yazig ze la'am. But when the Egyptians saw that v'cha'asher ya'anu oto kein yifrev v'kein yirbots, right? That's not the word, right? V'kein yifrot, sorry. So when they saw that, they did worse to them. Katsu b'chayehem mipnehem v'gazru sheyavidu kol Mitzrayim et ha'am v'chol ish Mitzri sheyitztarech ba'avodah yimshol lakachad mehem anashim sheyasu avodato. They passed a new rule. The new rule was no longer did you have to work exclusively for Paro. Any Egyptian who needed any work done for him could just grab a Jew off the street. And the idea was that would keep them down. V'zetam ya'avidu Mitzrayim et b'nei Yisrael b'farach. That's that pasuk, right? First it was just Paro. Va'yavidu Mitzrayim et b'nei Yisrael b'farach. All the Egyptians could enslave the Jews in whatever way was necessary to complete whatever jobs they had. So if Egyptians had to clean for Pesach, they obviously don't, they could take Jews. And that would be fine, that would be legal. Va'od gazru alehem avodot kashot bechomer uvilvenim, and that too also became more difficult. Presumably, if an Egyptian, got Jews to work for him, so originally the Egyptian gave the mops and the brooms and the cleaning stuff and all that stuff. But it says at some point they were gozer avodah kasha bechomer uvilvenim ki mitchila hayu asarim notnim lahem halevenim vayu anshe hamas bonim habinyan. Originally, the Egyptians would give the things necessary to do the job. They would give to the Jews, and the Jews would do the job. Va'ata nahagu ha'am ba'avodah v'tzivam sheyu mivi'im afar va'osim ha'chemar bidehem u'baraglehem. Now all of a sudden the Jews had to do it on their own. V'lo yinatein lahem ibeit hamelach rak hateven bilvad. The only thing that Paro's house would give them is the straw. Even that was taken away later. V'notnim halevenim la'anshe hamas habonim la'asot habinyan. V'gam kol avoda kasha asher lefaro l'mitzrayim b'sadeh kigon hachafirot v'hotzaot hazvalim hakol natnu alehem. All the menial work, all the most basic grunt work, we would call it, were given to the Jews. V'gam hayu rodim bahem lidchok otam shelo yanuchu umakim umekalim otam. It wasn't just the hard work, which would have been bad enough, but because Paro and the Egyptians were so worried that the Jews were multiplying and that they might take over or they might leave, so in addition to the horrific circumstances and the conditions that they gave them, they were mean to them, and they hit them, and they cursed them, and they made life difficult for them. V'zetam eit kol avodatam asher avdu bahem befarach. Okay, so that's the first point. Now, a really, really significant point that the Ramban kind of just buries in this longer Ramban, but I think it's important for our purposes. Says the Ramban, V'haya hamelech mifarnes otam belechem tsar kiminhag lepoalei hamelech. Says the Ramban, now, once they took them for slaves completely, so they had to feed them. So he says, so the Melech fed them with lechem tsar. I think that Ibn Ezra here says explicitly it was matzah, right? What was so useful? Why would the king, supply them with matzah? So think about it. It doesn't really spoil. It's not nutritious, but it's cheap. And it fills you up. It stops you up. It constipates you. So that you could feed a lot of people a little bit of matzah and that would work. Now we get to a difficult place. Later on, when the Jews complained, they said, Zacharnu et hadaga asher nochal b'mitzrayim chinam, et hakishuim ve'et ha'avatichim ve'et ha'chatzir ve'et ha'bitzalim ve'et ha'shumim. Now the Ramban wants to know, is that really true or not? Right? There are two pshatim there. Yes, these people who are complaining about the man and about the Slav, when God was so good to them, remember, it was so great in Egypt. Could it really have been so great in Egypt? Could they have really given them fish and watermelons and things like that? So the Ramban thinks yes. Etc. Ki hadaga b'mitzrayim rabba ma'od. There were a lot of fish in Mitzrayim, I guess from the Nile. Vayu lokchim min hatzadim otam b'mitzvat hamelech. Jews could take fish from the fishermen because the fish was so abundant, and they could say, the king says we could do this. V'lokchim min haginot kishuim va'abatichim, and they could go into gardens and take vegetables. Ve'ein mechalim ki mitzvat hamelachi, because they're working for the king. So they're entitled to it. V'rabotenu amru avodim limlachim hayu v'lo avodim la'avodim. Right? We weren't slaves to slaves who were slaves to Paro. Im kain vayavidu mitzrayim remez l'sareh hamisim asher lefaro. So the Ramban had two different ideas here. The first is that the king just fed them with cheap food because that was the easiest and the cheapest way to go. But the other pshat seems to be that they were servants to the king, and the king, therefore, at least at the beginning, was obligated to feed them. How did he feed them? Well, there was abundant fish that was being caught from the Nile, and there was a lot of vegetables and fruits that were growing in people's gardens, and Jews could eat those foods because it was Paro they were working for. And Paro was obligated to feed them, and therefore they could take food from other people, right? The nafkamina being, later on when the Jews complained that life was so good in Egypt, was that made up or not? According to one pshat, it was made up. Of course they didn't eat fish and vegetables and all these things. But according to the Ramban's second pshat, they did. That was the fact. And now that they could only eat slav, and now that they could only eat man, and now, they had a real complaint. Okay, that's difficult, but that's the Ramban. Now, let's go to the most important, or the Ramban I really, really want to focus on more than others this week. And that is the very, very beginning of Perek Bet, where the pasuk says, not the very beginning of Perek Bet, towards the end of Perek Bet, the Torah is telling us, again, if you're following the narrative, and the narrative is fascinating, Moshe tries to be saved by his mother, and he's put in the basket, etc., and then you have the following, and then he's taken out, and Tzipporah takes him back to Yocheved, and she raises him to a certain extent because she can nurse him. And then he grows up. Vayol Moshe I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong place. No, Vayol Moshe Lashevet et Ha'ish. Yeah. Then he goes to Midian, and he saves the daughters, and Yisro says, live with me. And then you have Vayehi bayamim harabim hahem. It's a strange expression in the Torah. What are yamim rabim hahem? Vayamat melech Mitzrayim vayanchu b'nei Yisrael min ha'avodah vayizaku vatal shavatam el ha'elohim min ha'avodah. Okay, and our cries went up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says the Ramban, Vayehi bayamim harabim hahem. I'm not starting at the very beginning of the Ramban. I'm picking up in the middle. Ulefi da'ati kitam hakatuv hazeh Yirmoz al hayamim shayam Moshe boreach mipnei paro. Right? Bayamim harabim hahem means the days or the years, and we'll see it is the years, that Moshe was running away from Paro. Ki be'emet bin urav barach. This is fascinating. It's so, once Ramban says it, it's obvious, but it's fascinating. How old was Moshe when he ran away from Egypt? So says the Ramban, when you read the story, it says, that he grew up. Right? He says, how old was he? Sheha katuv amar vayigdal Moshe vayetze elachav shahayazem miyad kasher gadal va'amad al da'ato v'higidu lo ki hu Yehudi. Right? He grew up. He became bar mitzvah. And he found out that he was Jewish. V'nichsaf lirot sivlot achav va'amalam v'lachatzam. And he desired to see what was happening to his people. Right? If you go up in the palace, you don't watch the slaves all day long. But Moshe decided to join them. Ubayom hahu sheyatsa hikat hamitzri. Says Ramban, the very, very first day that he went out and he saw the Egyptian abusing a Jew, he killed the Egyptian. Ubayom hasheni hilshinu alav ubarach. The second day, the bad Jews, Dasan and Anvim, whoever they were, told on Moshe, and he was forced to escape from Egypt. Hine haya kiben shtei mesrei shana. He couldn't have been more than 12 years, says the Ramban. But then he changed his mind a little bit. Kasher yizkir abotenu. Va'al kol panim lo higia le'esrim. Obviously, he couldn't have been more than 20. Now, why does this matter? Because uba amdo lifnei faro haya ben shmonim. When he came back to Egypt, right, we like to think of it, and in the movies it's portrayed as he's a young man and he goes out and he escapes and he goes to Midian and then he immediately comes back. But in the Torah, says the Ramban, you can tell by the ages. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he came back, the Torah says he was 80 years old. He was shmonim shana ba'amdo lifnei Pharaoh, right? But there's no way he was that old when he ran away. He was somewhere, says the Ramban, somewhere between 12 and 20 at the max. So it means there is 60 years of radio silence in the Torah. When Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm saying this, but I think the Ramban would say it also. When Moshe Rabbeinu left Egypt, he wasn't yet Moshe Rabbeinu. He was an Ish Mitzri. He felt an emotional connection, but that's all. And then he came back at the age of 80, and maybe he wasn't yet the Adon HaNevi'im, but he was much more than he was beforehand. And the Torah hides all of that. Rav Moshe Lichtenstein wrote a whole sefer on it. I forgot the name of it. Tzir V'Tzon. That's the name. It has an English name also. That the whole sefer is about the 60 years where the Torah doesn't tell us how Moshe Rabbeinu became Moshe Rabbeinu, which is very similar to the fact that the Torah doesn't tell us how Avram Avinu became Avram Avinu. Imkain, Amad Kmo Shishim Shana Boreach Milifnei Faro. So he was 60 years that he was trying to stay away from Paro. Now, for the narrative, the Ramban has a really, really important point to make here. The way we read the Psukim, Moshe escaped to Midian, went to the well, met Tzipporah, etc., etc. But it says the Ramban, no, Vahakarov, the way it appears to me, Vahakarov, Ki Bisof Hazman Ba LeMidian V'Nasat Tzipporah. Says the Ramban, it wasn't the first thing he did. The sense you get, says the Ramban, is that he came to Tzipporah late. Ki kishahaya lo hadibur hazeh adayin lo holid mimena rak b'noha b'chol gershom. Right? Because the story with Eliezer, the second son, was that on the way to Egypt, the Malach wanted to kill Moshe. It's the end of this week's parasha. We're not going to do the Ramban on that. But the sense you get is, he was just born. Avalo izkira katuv b'brichato rak vayeshev be'eretz Midyan vayeshev ala be'er ki lo nitchadesh biyamim ha'acherim inyan sheyitztarech hakatuv l'sapro. He says the Torah didn't find the need to tell us what Moshe did for those 60 years because it wasn't that interesting. V'chein hadavar ki haboreach min ha'malchut lo yitakev be'ir moshav v'karov lo. If you're running away from Paro, the most important leader of the world at the time, you're not going to just go someplace and live there for 60 years. Aval yivrach mi makom lemakom el eretz merchakim. You go from place to place and you stay on the run. V'inei amad yamim rabim mitchabei umitnaker migoy el goy umimamlacha lamacher. He spent a long time running from place to place and from people to people because he was afraid of Paro. Ubisof hazman, when he's older already, when he's 75, when he's 78, I don't know how long, but it's the end of the time. Bala Midyan v'nitakev sham. Only then did he come to Midyan. V'zetam vayeshev be'eretz Midyan. That's the reason the Torah says vayeshev be'eretz Midyan. Ki ra'ui haya sheyomar vayelech el eretz Midyan. Why does it say vayeshev instead of vayelech? Aval ramaz shelo yashav be'ir ad bisof sheba el eretz Midyan v'sham yashav. No, the hint of the Torah is he went to many other places, then he came to Midyan, and there he stayed. Umipnei shizkira katav brichato mipnei paro v'shivto b'Midyan uba lahazkir miyad shehu shav leMitzrayim b'mitzvato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Torah is only interested in he ran away from Paro. Then the most significant thing that happened 50-something years later is he came to Midyan, and then he went to the Sneh, and then God told him, you have to go back to Egypt. When you read the Psukim, says the Ramban, he's not blaming anybody. It sounds like all this happened sequentially. He ran away from Paro, he came to Midyan, he met Zipporah, he married her, he went to shepherd the flock, he saw the burning bush, and God said, go back to Mitzrayim. Says the Ramban, but it didn't happen that way. Ba katov lirmoz lanu ha'inyan kasher haya. V'amar vayhi bayamim harabim hahem. Therefore, the Torah says vayhi bayamim harabim hahem. You shouldn't think all these things happened immediately. Shaya Moshe borech mipnei paro va'omeid b'midyan mehem umeit bayamim hahem b'sofa melech Mitzrayim. Vayala Moshe gilui hashchina binyan zeh. Then Moshe met God at the Sneh. V'hushav l'Mitzrayim u'ge'alam. Va'al kein lo amar vayhi acharei yamim rabim. Ki hayam mashma'o mishevet Moshe b'midyan v'lo hayu hayamim harabim hahem rak l'chol hamisupar l'mala. So the Ramban is telling us something significant about this story, but the Ramban is also derech agav telling us something significant about how the Torah tells us things. He says the Torah is a sefer of action. The Torah tells us the stories we need to know for purposes of the narrative. But here's a good example, says the Ramban. It was 60 years, it was more than 60 years from the time Moshe left Mitzrayim till the time Moshe came back to Mitzrayim. But in our psukim, basically the only things that happened was he went to Midyan, he had children, and he went to the Sneh. So said the Ramban, that's not what happened. What the Ramban is also telling us is that, Moshe Rabbeinu developed as a person. One of the problems we have, and I say this because it's a problem I have, is that when we see people in the Torah, we assume that the people we meet are who they are forever. The first time I meet Moshe Rabbeinu, he's Moshe Rabbeinu. He's the Adon HaNevi'im. He's the greatest person who ever lived. When I meet Avram Avinu, he's already Avram Avinu. When I meet Yitzchak, when I meet Yaakov, when I meet Yosef. But there is, I'm sorry to use a secular term, there is character development. There is the sense that Moshe Rabbeinu grew. And here's a really good example, although it's two different shitos in the Ramban. Okay, let's do the last one we're going to do because we run out of time, but it's really, really important. Moshe's at the Sneh. And he's having this back and forth with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it's painful, and it's extended, and it's long. But then at some point in Pasuk Yud Gimel, Parak Gimel, Pasuk Yud Gimel, the Torah tells us as follows. Moshe says to God, Vayomer Moshe el ha-Elohim, Hine anochi meit, Hine anochi ba el b'nei Yisrael, Va'amarti lahem, Elohei avotechem shlachani alechem, Va'amru li ma shemo, ma omar aleihem. When they say to me, what's the name of the God who sent you? What am I going to tell them? Okay? And says the Ramban, Ha pasuk hazeh omer lanu lecha parsheni. This pasuk needs to be darshaned. Why? Ki lo yitachen she'omar Moshe v'omru li ma shemo liyot lahem ot sheyaminu bo. The Jews couldn't say, what's God's name? If you tell us the right name, if his name is Maurice, then we're gonna worship him. Ki she'elat shemo va'amirato lahem eina ot lemisha lo yamin bo mitchila. If you didn't believe in God, so you're not going to believe in him now. Shim yedu Yisrael oto Hashem, gam Moshe kahem yoda oto. Right? If it turns out that Bnei Yisrael had a Mesorah, that the deliverer is going to call God by a certain name, he's going to say certain words. So fine, the same way that Bnei Yisrael knew those words, so Moshe Rabbeinu could have known those words. Shim yedu Yisrael oto Hashem, gam Moshe kahem yoda oto. V'hine yidiato ki yidiatam. Ve'inena otu mofeit klal. It's no proof of anything. Moshe Rabbeinu knew the words because he grew up in, amongst the Jewish people. V'im lo shamu bo, ma hara'aya she'aminu bidvarav klal. And if there aren't secret words, so what can Moshe say to them that would make him be believed? V'hine, acharei hodio et Hashem hagadol omar, ve'hein lo ya'aminu li, va'az natan lo otot. And even later on, after God tells him his quote-unquote name, Moshe Rabbeinu says, they're still not going to believe me. Says the Ramban. This is not the point in the Ramban I wanted, but it's the Ramban. Ulefi dati, I'm skipping a few lines. Haya Moshe gam ba'etahi av b'chachma, gadol b'ma'alat ha'nevuah. Moshe Rabbeinu, even at the sneh, was a Navi. Okay, this contradicts a few Medrashim, and it contradicts the Ramban later, who's going to say, no, when Moshe says, Vayaster panav mehabit ki areh mehabit el Elokim, yeah, that's Moshe at that time. Later on, he became pe'el pe'ad daber bo b'marev v'lo b'chidot utmunat Hashem yabit. But not yet. But says the Ramban, Moshe Rabbeinu was a Navi at the time, and again, he's hinting at, but we need to figure out what happened during the 60 years that turned Moshe into a Navi. What did he think about? What was the reflections on Mitzrayim? What was his reflections on world events? What did he think about the fact that God enslaved his people? All these things are not in the Psukim. They're in Medrashim. And we have to spend time thinking about it. V'deh, says the Ramban, V'derech she'ela bikei shi'odieu mi ha'sholeach oto, kilomar be'ezo midahu shaluach aleihem. Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't asking God for his name. He was asking God for a deeper thing. He was asking God, what midah of God is sending me? Let's just do the simple ones, even though I think there's a deeper Kabbalistic idea here. Midat harachamim and midat hadin, right? Those are the two dominant midot of God. So Moshe Rabbeinu was saying to God, is it that you feel terrible for the Jews and therefore you're going to redeem them? Or do they deserve it? Is it midat hadin? The Jews have suffered enough. They're good people. You're sending me to redeem them? Or no, something worse. It's not that they deserve it, but the midat harachamim is sending me. Okay, the Ramban goes on that way. That's a whole discussion. The whole idea of in whose merit and why the Jews are being redeemed is a big, big discussion. But then you come to the next part. I'm skipping a bunch of lines. V'hakavana lahem, what does God say to him? He says, Eheyeh asher eheyeh. V'hakavana lahem b'zeh. Ki Moshe amar lefanav yitbarach v'amar li ma shemo sheyagid lahem Hashem. Sheyoreh hora'ah shlema lamitziyut v'alashgacha v'akadosh baruch hu yishivu lama ze yishalu lishmi ein lahem tzorech l'raya acheret ki yeheyeh imahem b'chol tzaratam yikra'eni ve'enem v'hi harehaya hagidola sheyesh Elokim b'Yisrael krovim eleinu b'chol kareinu I love. This, I think, is an amazing point. Says the Ramban, God never answered Moshe's question. When he said, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, It wasn't his name. He was saying, why do you need my name? Why does it matter? I'm telling you, going forward, I will be with them when they're exiled. Right? That's the medrash. But the Ramban says that's the answer. What do we want out of God? Who do we want to worship? The answer is we want to worship a God who's with us at our worst times. We want to worship a God who's with us in our exiles. There are going to be bad times in Jewish history. There are bad times now. But we need to feel, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe at the Sneh, when, in a way, you say this HaKadosh Baruch Hu's introduction to Klal Yisrael. Of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu existed and he created the world. But now we're getting to know him the way he wants us to get to know him. And he says, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. And when the Medrash says, and Rashi's all bothered by the Medrash, why are you telling us about other Galuyos? God says, because that's who I am. That's who the Jewish people should know me as. Not by a unique name, but by the fact that I am going to identify with them. And the sense that when the Jews are exiled, God is exiled. And the sense that when the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, yes, it's God who destroys the Beis HaMikdash, not the Romans and not other Goyim. But God's destroying his home, and God is kiviyachol hichtiv al atzmo galut. God is going into galus with us. That's what we want, and that's who we want. We want to feel in our pain that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with us, and we want to feel in our joy and our celebration that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with us. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, it's not his name. It's his midos. It's who he is. He's telling Moshe, the name doesn't matter. It's who I am that matters. And I am going forward going to be the God that's with you in both good times and bad times. Okay, so very quickly, we saw the Ramban's focus on each sefer being its own sefer, and therefore each sefer starting with sort of the end of the sefer before. We saw the step-by-step development of the Avdos in Mitzrayim, that, first he took them for particular jobs and let them go home, etc., etc. We saw two shitos about the end of that story, when the Jews later on complained, Zacharnu et hadaga, we remember how good it was in Egypt. Is that really true or not? The Ramban had two different shitos about that. And the most important thing we saw is Vayihi bayamim harabim hahem, the exile, the fact that there was more than 60 years between when Moshe Rabbeinu left and when he came back, and how that plays into his relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his personal growth and our relationship with God. Okay, went a little extra today. Yashkach to everybody. Shabbat Shalom, and see you, God willing, next week.